Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight in this rain. I'm sure Jim is a very exciting guy to come and see, and the rain isn't going to stop anyone. My name is Katrina Brown, and I'm the president of the Dalhousie Faculty Association. We're pleased to welcome you to this latest event in our Issues on Higher Education discussion series, a public lecture entitled Money, Myths, and Manipulation, Debunking Austerity Economics by economist, columnist, and author Jim Stanford. We've been hearing the austerity economics rhetoric for some time from governments intent on cutting social spending and increasingly to rationalize cuts to post-secondary education funding. Our own university administration, like most in Canada, joins in justifying program cuts while starving resources necessary for quality education. Together, choices made by government to cut back university funding alongside choices by senior university administration have created a growing threat to post-secondary education in Nova Scotia. We need to argue against the university's claims that financing and reducing deficits necessarily requires the cuts of programs and tenure-track faculty, a growing reliance on casualized or precarious part-time faculty, program prioritization, and struggles in some departments to maintain accreditation due to a lack of resources. At the same time we hear these claims, we see new buildings after new buildings going up, and evidence of a top-heavy system of management through the ballooning of senior university administration. At the provincial level, the government has told us that there will be a $50 million shortfall in funding for post-secondary education over the next few years, while forging a clear business model agenda with the university centering on economic sustainability. This is not surprising, given that operating funding to universities has been cut for 4 consecutive years, including this year, with a so-called increase of 1%, which represents just under half the rate of inflation. So the shortfall is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The government fails to place sufficient priority on post-secondary education, and then they argue that we just have to tighten our belts. The problem becomes one, then, of both government cutbacks and the choices that universities make in spending the money that they do have. You can check out our review of Dalhousie finances that are available at the back on the table if you like later. So like many of you, I'm not an economist, but I know when I'm being manipulated by all this talk of austerity. But in order to make a good case against the austerity agenda, we wanted to bring in someone who is an economist, and no one is more well-suited to this conversation than Jim Stanford. Jim wears a lot of different hats. He's the economist for Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union, and vice president of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York, and also holds economics degrees from Cambridge University and University of Calgary. His columns appear in the Globe and Mail, and he's the author of the book Economics for Everyone, which has been translated into 6 languages. You can also see him regularly on CBC Television's Bottom Line Economics panel. And he is a prolific social media communicator with some 8,400 followers on Twitter. Let's give Jim a warm welcome.
Okay, so now I got to get myself wired. I got to de-wire Katrina and wire myself. So there we go. Forgive this for just a moment. One on each lapel. There we go. And I also have one of those Apple plugins, you know, the white ones, that goes right in my butt that keeps me charged up. But the problem is, Apple changed the adapter so that you have to go out and buy a new one. And I haven't done that yet, so there we go. Oh my God, I'm totally tangled here. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, this is going to work. This is going to work. One is for you, and one is for the video, you see? That's what we're on here. Okay, there we go. Now, if I do a somersault with a half twist, it will all fit. Okay, now we're in business. Okay, thank you very much. Well, Katrina, thank you very much. My old friend Katrina Brown, we have grad school connections that go way back, which is why I'm here tonight, to support Katrina and support the Dell Faculty Association in the effort that you're having to change the discourse, really, is what it's all about. We are, as Katrina just said, you said you're not an economist, but you just summed it up right there. You said, we've heard the storyline so often that there's no choice. All we can do is cut. That we really do need to change the discourse, and that's what tonight is all about. I even wrote down your quote, Katrina. It's a great one. I'm not an economist, but I know when I'm being manipulated. Okay, so I'm gonna remember that one, because that is miles ahead of most economists, right there. It actually. It reminds me of the famous quote by Joan Robinson, who was the wonderful feminist, progressive economist in Britain in the 1950s. She said once, "The purpose of studying economics is to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists." So in that regard, that's what we're here for. Another famous quote about economists is they're people who are good with numbers but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So in that regard, you may soon wonder, why the hell did I go out on a rainy night in Halifax to hear this and all the charts and graphs and so on? But we'll try to keep it in English. In fact, you mentioned, Katrina, generously that my book has been translated into 6 languages, one of which was English, in fact. So we will have a few charts and graphs tonight, but we will endeavor to keep it on the level that people can take and run with. And that's what the goal is here. I know that the Faculty Association here is in the middle of discussions with the university, but all of us in our respective constituencies are in discussions with the higher-ups, whether it's the federal government or the provincial government or the municipal government or the new hospital authority or whoever else, who are spouting exactly the same rhetoric. And it's astounding not only how common the rhetoric of austerity is, but also how audacious they are. And I think the Broughton report that came out a few days ago here is one of the most audacious yet. I think it's actually a wonderful research subject to analyze this report and how try to understand how it is in this time and place. Anyone would even have the nerve to put that in print, let alone to actually propose it as a model for economy going forward. So here's a few of links for those who want to follow up. My Twitter handle, of course. I have 8,400 followers. I think at least 2 of them are my friends. So of course there's a difference between being followed and having friends. Those are 2 different things, as I constantly try to tell my teenage kids. And I'll learn the lesson myself someday. PolicyAlternatives.ca is the website of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which in my judgment is the preeminent progressive think tank in Canada that's been consistently challenging the ideology of austerity, and of course which has an excellent branch right here in Halifax. Progressive-economics.ca is the website for the Progressive Economics Forum. This is a network of progressive economists. I always laugh when I'm sometimes introduced as one of Canada's leading left-wing economists, because I always stand up and say the other 2 are really good too. You know, you shouldn't jump to conclusions. But in fact, through our Progressive Economics Forum, we now have over 100 members, and I know there's a few in the room tonight, and a blog site that sometimes gets reported in the media, and we sponsor an essay contest for students who are studying economics to help them, support them in challenging the sort of supply and demand nonsense that gets rammed down their throats. And then economicsforeveryone.ca, the website that goes with my book. There's all kinds of free pedagogical materials there, lectures, glossaries, student exercises, other stuff. If anyone is an educator or does even popular education in your union or your community group or whatever, there's a ton of resources there. And one free ad, the second edition of Economics for Everyone will be coming out in May next year. I'm just finishing the manuscript. If I have bags under my eyes tonight, that's why. And the first edition came out in 2008. There's one or two things that have happened in the world economy since 2008. So I figured I should update the book, and it will be coming out from Pluto in England and co-published by the CCPA. Okay, there's the preliminaries. Let's get to the meat of the matter tonight. The myth of austerity. These arguments you hear over and over again. We just can't afford it anymore. Okay, this idea, the things you used to take for granted, we just can't afford anymore. Whether that's your health care, your education, your pensions, your wages, whatever. Whatever it is you want in life, we just can't afford it anymore. And this idea that times have changed, wake up and smell the latte. Second myth of austerity, we'd better start cutting, given that we can't afford it anymore, or we're all going to end up like Greece. Okay, clearly that's the slippery slope we're headed on if we refuse to face the reality of the situation. And the fact of the matter is there's no choice. That's all there is to it. There is no alternative. That was the famous slogan pioneered by Margaret Thatcher in the early days of what we now know to be neoliberalism. So, stop wasting hot air complaining about it. This is all there is. This is the exact line that has been repeated time and time again all over the world, including here in Canada, including here in Nova Scotia, at every level of administration. Again, as I say, whether it's federal, provincial, municipal, or at an individual university, as the Faculty Association, our sponsors tonight, are grappling with, or the level of an individual health authority or any other body that's trying to foist this on us. So, in reality, we can afford the things that we used to take for granted, and then some. That will be one of my themes tonight. In reality, governments that go about blindly cutting with knee-jerk austerity because they don't know what else to do are actually going to make the problem worse, not better, in a number of dimensions. And in reality, we always have choices. And if there's one lesson from tonight, it is this belief, this claim that we do have choices, that the economy is nothing more than the sum total of our collective labor as human beings to produce stuff and then use the stuff that we produce. And there are always choices in that action. There's nothing inevitable about it. There's nothing technical. There's nothing preordained. There's nothing autonomous about it. Even this whole culture that it's all driven by markets, by anonymous, impersonal supply and demand forces. When you hear about them talking about the markets think this, the markets feel that. It's almost like they're talking about some beast, right? Some beast, some dragon that lives in the cave, and you got to throw it a steak every now and then, or the markets are going to get restless. But the reality is there's no such thing as the markets. What there are is other human beings who have certain powers, certain privileges, certain wealth, certain tools at their disposal, and they're fighting for their interests. So we'd better wake up and start fighting for our interests. So that's the shortcut for the whole theme of the presentation. And if anyone is worried about the charts and graphs that are coming, I won't be offended if you take your umbrella and go home now, because you've heard the conclusion. But let's start with a little bit of simple economics. What can we afford and what can't we afford? And where does this idea come from that stuff we used to take for granted just can't be afforded anymore? The reality is that what we call the gross domestic product of Canada or Nova Scotia is nothing more and nothing less than the sum total of the value added by the productive human activity of all of us as Canadians and as Nova Scotians. Okay? We start with nature. This is very important these days to remember, that we need a place to stand, land to live and work on, air to breathe, water to drink, and we need the resources that we harvest from nature, because every job that we do in society requires those resources, those inputs. None of us work with our bare hands and our bare hands alone. Even a massage therapist, okay, works with their hands, but they also need they need a table for the client to lie on. They need massage oil, right? Otherwise it gets kind of uncomfortable. They need a towel to cover their client's butt with. Otherwise it gets a little uncomfortable. So even in a massage therapy situation, you're using resources that you harvested from nature as one of the inputs to your work. But the value that's added at every step along the way comes from our productive human endeavor, our brains and our brawn, our willingness to get up and do something useful. And by work, I mean a very inclusive, generic definition. That can be physical labor, of course, with our brawn. It can be our ability to think, to solve problems, to be creative with our brains. It can be the direct labor that we do in production, producing something that's useful, or it can be the indirect labor that we do, producing tools and capital equipment and technology that we don't produce for its own sake, but in order for it to be used to produce something else. It doesn't matter whether you are paid by the hour or paid a monthly salary. Guess what? If you're paid a monthly salary, you're not really a professional by virtue of getting a salary. You're still a worker. You're still employed. You're still employed at the behest of somebody who hired you to do work under their direction, and they own the work that you're performing, and they'll kick your butt out on the street as surely as any assembly line worker when your services aren't needed anymore. And if there's anyone who knows that, it's the Faculty Association. Because that's exactly what's been happening through the, through the leaning and meaning of academic work, if you like. In fact, I always joke about salaried workers who say, I'm not a worker, I'm a professional. Because chances are they're putting in dozens of hours of unpaid overtime every month. This is my guess, in general, because it's part of the job description. And I think I'm laughing because, I work with factory workers in uniform who wouldn't work 5 minutes of overtime without getting paid for it. So guess who's the sucker in this? It's the professional. Doesn't matter whether you're working in the private sector or the public sector. Guess what? The public sector is a source of value added. The value that's created by people in hospitals and schools and every other public sector endeavor is valuable, and it does show up in our GDP. It's not a drain. It's not a burden. It's actually an opportunity. It's a source of value added and a source of job creation. In fact, if you look at the rather miserable record of Canada's economy in creating jobs since the last recession, there's a disproportionate share of it, around half actually, that's been created in the broad public sector category. So stop seeing it as a drain, start seeing it as an opportunity. Healthcare alone in Canada has created over 200,000 jobs since the recession ended. If any other industry had created 200,000 jobs, you'd be waving your hands and saying, this is amazing. Look at the interesting opportunity that's here. Yet because it's public sector, it's considered a drain. So this is fundamental. This is economics 101 here, folks. Where do we get value added from? We take what's available in nature, we harvest it, hopefully in a sustainable way, and then we add value to it through our work. And there's nothing ultimately more complex than that, and it is a four-letter word named work. It is a four-letter word on Monday morning, when you can hear a few four-letter words, right? As the alarm clock rings and you have to drag your sorry butt off to the job. But as much as we complain about it, of course, we recognize that we need the work, we want the capacity to produce, to contribute to the economy, to support ourselves and our family, and hopefully, in an ideal situation, to get some kind of personal gratification from it. So, how is it that things are scarce? Where does this whole idea of scarcity come from? This idea that there's just a shortage, a metaphysical shortage of things out there that we have to get used to, and we have to tighten our belts continuously. It isn't money that we're short on, that's clear. The private banking industry in capitalism creates money out of thin air at the stroke of a pen every time it issues a loan to someone. So you can't say there's a shortage of money. If you ever believe there was a shortage of money, go and study quantitative easing, this little trick that the US Federal Reserve has played for the last 5 years, where they created literally over $2 trillion of new money out of thin air. And they used it in a very peculiar and particular way to try and get the economy going, and it did have some benefits, although I think they could have done it much better. But if you think money is scarce, a public bank or a private bank can create it out of thin air just like that. Another quote another famous economist quote that I love, John Kenneth Galbraith. The method by which the banking system creates money is so simple that the mind is repelled. Okay? Which sums it up, right? Because you sound like a quack, don't you? I sound like a lunatic when I stand up here and I say the banks create money out of thin air and it's an enormous conspiracy. But I've always learned that just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not following you, okay? So think that one through before you write me off as a lunatic. So money is not scarce. Capital is not scarce. Capital is nothing more than money that's used in some kind of business setting. In fact, Canadian non-financial corporations are sitting on over $600 billion of the stuff. That would be the cash and liquid resources that they have that they're not investing in real business, but they're just sitting on. So capital is not scarce. Revenues are not fundamentally scarce. Governments have all kinds of power and choices to make regarding how they collect the revenues, including, as the Americans and the British and the Japanese have done, creating it out of thin air, if that's what's required to provide services and put people to work. The only things that ultimately limit our capacity to produce the goods and services that we need are what economists call the primary factors of production. And that's us as human beings with our capacity to work, and nature, which has to provide the place to work and the resources that we need in order to work. If we aren't fully utilizing our resources and the resources that are around us, then the whole idea that we're somehow constrained, that we're limited, that there's a shortage is a crock. It's an absolute crock. It's a pure ideology to distract us from the real problem and get us to agree to tighten our belts, not because they need tightening, but because somebody else wants to tighten them for us. So it's our ability to produce that is our ultimate limit on what we can have in society, and we are far, far, far away from the true constraint on our ability to produce. And you can see that by just looking around us at the number of people who are doing nothing. Is labor scarce in Canada today? Are we somehow limited from producing those goods and services, and that's why we have to get used to it, doing with less? You know, stuff we used to afford in the 60s and the 70s, we have to somehow do with less because the number of workers is shrunk? No, the number of workers has grown, not shrunk. And what's over, each individual worker can produce more and produce better than they used to because of technology and productivity growth. So in history, it's very, very rare that you can find situations where labor is truly scarce, where you're absolutely limited by what you can produce by a shortage of people. About the only time that's happened in Canada would have been in World War II, when the government's war effort literally put every able-bodied person, including taking women out of the homes and putting them to work in the formal paid labor market, and then kicking them back into the homes when the war was over. But for that moment in World War II, you might have been able to sustain the claim that we're limited in terms of what we can produce. But today, our capacity to produce is greater than ever. And sometimes this comes through in the most, in a way, kind of trivial but pragmatic ways. And where I live now in Toronto, some of the schools have got swimming pools in them. Okay, it's not common, but maybe a third of schools have got a swimming pool in the school. And this dates back to an idea, what an idea it was in the 50s and 60s, and probably the 70s. I sound like an oldies goldies disc jockey, don't I? The greatest economic policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's been all shit since then. Except the music, of course. The music was best in the 80s, because that's when I went to college, and the music of when you went to college is, of course, the greatest music ever produced, whenever it was that you went to college. Anyways, these pools are in the schools, okay, and the government is saying we can't afford pools anymore. And I'm thinking, why the hell can't we afford pools anymore? Do you know how rich Toronto is today compared to what it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? It's probably twice as rich. There's probably twice as much income, twice as much gross domestic product, twice as much wealth. Don't even get started on the condos and everything else that's being built there. How can you honestly say that this city cannot afford to have swimming pools in the schools where kids can have exercise? We're all concerned about kids having exercise. Where immigrant children can learn how to swim. We're always concerned about how many immigrant children drown because they never had swimming lessons until they came to Canada. Okay? So, get real. It's absolute nonsense that we just can't afford these things anymore. Water, honestly hasn't gotten more expensive, okay, since then. So every now and then we've just got to stand back and say, what on earth are you talking about? And this whole austerity agenda is precisely a manipulative ideology. The economic foundation for austerity is a fraud. The fundamental claim that we can't afford stuff that we used to take for granted is wrong. And they're trying to trick us, basically. They're trying to make us accept a sense of scarcity and inevitable belt tightening to get us to do things that we wouldn't do under normal circumstances. Okay, Naomi Klein, the great Canadian author, called it shock doctrine. Okay, has anybody read Shock Doctrine, the book that she wrote, this fabulous book? And she summed it up precisely. She said you have to create a crisis in order to win these changes that the rich and powerful want from us, including taking away the concept of swimming pools in public schools. Okay, because that's nonsense. That's you know, if you get used to swimming pools in public schools, well, you'll expect free health care. And who knows what will be next? Bolshevik communism, no doubt. So we better start rolling it back. But to roll it back, we've got to shock people out of this sense of entitlement that they have. The economic reality is we can still afford swimming pools in our schools, and we can afford everything else that we used to provide in Canada, okay, and then some, because our capacity to produce those goods and services, to generate those incomes and that wealth, is greater than it's ever been. What do our leaders have to say about this? Well, here's a few choice quotes. Here's our employment minister, Mr. Kenney. This was actually a tweet. This was on social media that he sent out within moments of being appointed employment minister. And look what he says about this issue of the scarcity of labor. He says, "I will work hard to end the paradox of too many people without jobs in an economy that has too many jobs without people." Okay, so let's deconstruct that statement just for a minute. Okay? There's no shortage of jobs. There's no aggregate problem of unemployment. It's all a question of mismatch, right? It's all a question of round pegs and square holes. Yes, we do recognize there are Canadians out there who are unemployed, but the only reason they're unemployed is because they don't fit the requirements of the jobs that are available. Well, this is empirically nonsensical, as I will show you, but this is him trying to, first of all, slough off any responsibility as employment minister for creating jobs, which should be 95% of the responsibility of an employment minister by my books. Blame the unemployed for their own plight because they don't have the right characteristics or the right work attitude or the right skills, or they don't live in the right part of the country. Okay, so it's their own damn fault. Okay, and then third, promote this idea that we're somehow constrained, right? As opposed to the key problem is actually putting people back to work. So there's Mr. Kenney's view. What about our Prime Minister? Our Prime Minister says, "We've emerged from the worst global economic downturn since the Great Depression with an economy that is the envy of the entire world." So he was never known for his modesty, and now we know why. I don't know why he didn't just say the envy of the entire galaxy or the envy of the entire universe, right? The envy of the entire world. What a ridiculous, ridiculous thing to say. You don't have to travel very far and wide to see that there are many other places in the world doing much better than Canada when you look objectively at the data in terms of recovering from that crisis and building prosperity, as opposed to patting yourself on the back nonstop for 6 years, which is what they've done in Ottawa. I mean, this can get very painful. I mean, try this with me, okay? Take your arm, pat yourself on the back here. I mean, even after a couple of minutes, you get sore. You know, you could switch hands, okay? That would help. But you do this for 6 years, you're going to get a hell of an RSI, okay? That's all I can say. As a union guy who's worked in health and safety a little bit, you know, you got to watch out for that kind of thing. So they've been patting themselves on the back for 6 years, and we are allegedly the envy of the entire world. Here's Mr. Oliver, our finance minister, who said the other day, "Our sound economic management, blah, 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 blah. Canada, an international economic success story." And he stood up and said, "Hooray, thank me, I've delivered you the balanced budget. I've delivered you the balanced budget. And aren't I prudent?" This is what he said last week. And didn't our austerity work, in fact? This is what they're saying. So he actually created a deficit. I'm surprised he wasn't struck by lightning, frankly, when he stood up and said how prudent I am. He actually, this very year, created a deficit. The budget would be balanced right now if it were not for this income-splitting tax scheme that they've dreamed up, that they're rushing through, that they want to get the checks out in the mail before the election for the obvious reason, the obvious political reason. So they actually pushed the whole economy, the whole budget back into deficit for that that premature tax cut. It's a dumb tax cut, even if Ottawa was rolling in money, but they were in such a hurry to get it out before the election that they were willing to put it back into deficit, and that's exactly what they've done. And then the next 2 years, 2015 and 2016, the only surplus they have is surplus that they'll have raided from the employment insurance system. Okay, the employment insurance system is generating a big surplus every year because everybody pays into it, but hardly any unemployed people can collect benefits. Less than 40% of unemployed people collect any benefits. So it's generating this big surplus that they're now raiding the cookie jar in order to subsidize their other priorities. So standing up and claiming that they're prudent is astounding. This is the one that got me. This is Stephen Poloz, Governor of the Bank of Canada, perhaps the most powerful economic policy maker in the country. If your parents are letting you live in the basement, go out and do something for free, you know. And if that wasn't tragic, it would be laughable. But the fact that he even said that, however well-meaning he might have been, the fact that he even said that just proves that the policymakers in this country are not taking the problem of unemployment seriously. They've actually internalized this idea that it's just a mismatch problem, and all we got to do is help people get the right skills and experience, even if it means working for free for a while, and the problem will take care of itself. And of course, to use a technical term in economics, that's sheer bullshit, okay? That's a technical term in economics. It means hypothesis not substantiated by empirical verification. Okay, so popular education, I'm supposed to define the terms as I go along. Okay, I just want to make sure you're with me here. Let's have a bit of a reality check. Has Canada's labor market recovered from the recession? Are we in fact the best in the world? And are we somehow shortage workers? Are we somehow short of workers, especially skilled workers? Are we in fact constrained? Is this where the scarcity constraint bites us because of a shortage of workers, and that's why we can't afford the things that we used to be able to afford? So let's talk about the scarcity of labor and the falling unemployment rate. Here's a technical illustration. A guy is out there looking for work. There aren't any jobs. I give up. Okay? Along comes the nerdy guy from Statistics Canada. Okay? And now look at the technical detail here, folks. Okay? Look carefully. We've spared no expense here. He's got a pocket protector. Do you see that? A pocket protector, a clipboard, thick-rimmed glasses. Okay? He's got a comb over, okay? We're making this as realistic as possible. He says, congratulations, you're no longer unemployed. Because the poor guy gave up looking for work, so therefore he disappeared from the unemployment statistics. Because to count as being unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work to the satisfaction of the Statistics Canada person who phoned you as part of the labor force survey. And in fact, most of the decline in Canada's unemployment rate, it's down to about 6.5% now, most of the decline since the recession has precisely been because of falling labor force participation and people giving up. So it's hardly anything to boast about, no matter how convenient it might be for the politicians. The sorry twist to this is, of course, it was the Statistics Canada person who got laid off because of the Harper government's war on knowledge. Here's a better description of the state of our labor market rather than the unemployment rate, okay, which depends on whether you're officially seeking work or not. I prefer to look at the employment rate, which simply says, are you working or not, okay? So it's kind of the flip side of the coin, and especially during weak times when people are likely to give up looking for work, this is a better measure of the true state of the labor market. So the employment rate was going along tickety-boo around 63.8% at peak before the recession. Then it fell off a cliff, and it fell dramatically over a few months when the global crisis hit to 61.3%. So that difference is 2.5 percentage points of the whole working age population in Canada that lost work as a result of the recession. Then we came in with the stimulus projects, right? We came in with the the different projects, including, you know, a subsidy for a contractor to work on your house, and some of the repairs to roads and bridges and hockey arenas and so on. And we got a bit of a rebound. Okay, not a whole lot of a rebound. We weren't remotely back to where we were. Okay, we got a bit of a rebound, then we hung there for a few years, and then look what's happened since 2012. The employment rate's been going down, which means that the jobs that are being created aren't even being created fast enough to keep up with the growing population. That's the point. Now the government assumes that we fell off a turnip truck yesterday, okay, and they say, well, there's more people working today than there were before the recession, therefore we've created jobs, aren't we great? But of course there's 2 million more working age Canadians today than there were before the recession. We have one of the fastest growing populations in the industrialized world. So just saying there's more people working today than there were in 2008 is hardly a claim to fame. You have to measure it relative to the size of the population. So if we were to get back to where we were, we'd need another 750,000 jobs, really, just to get back to where we were, which wasn't an ideal situation at all. This problem is not as severe if you're in a country like Japan or Germany, where the population is more or less steady. Okay, there you could get back to the same level of employment you had before, and that would be okay because you'd have the same population that you're working with. That does not apply in Canada's case. So the government, again, with this sort of self-congratulation, is trying to promote a deep sense of national pride. They're trying to rekindle the feeling among Canadians that we had when Canada won the gold medal in hockey, okay, in 2010, and then again in 2014. You know, the pucks and the boards are fighting for, the puck comes out to Crosby, Crosby shoots, he scores! Canada has won the gold medal! This is what they're hoping for, okay? Now there is a sports analogy here, but it is not the gold medal hockey team. It is the men's soccer team, which ranked 107th in the world according to the latest FIFA rankings. Okay, that is, we're not number one, we're actually very mediocre. That's the men, I hasten to clarify. The women's soccer team is very good. They rank 6th in the world, which suggests to me we should put the women in charge of the economy, and then this whole thing wouldn't be a problem, would it? So, so this is the problem. And in fact, if you look realistically, I know this is an ugly one to look at unless you've had a couple of beers. This is a ranking of the 34 industrial countries in the world according to that measure that I just described, the employment rate. Okay, it looks at the employment rate before the recession. It looks at the employment rate several years after the recession. What was the change? Okay, how did we do at getting our people back in work? Okay, whether that involves creating jobs or not depends all on the whole population growth thing. And in fact, when you measure it this way, which is more meaningful, Canada ranked 20th after the first 4 years of the recovery, 20th out of the 34 countries. So we're not even in the top half, let alone number one. We've done better than some countries, including the Americans at that point, although the Americans are now rapidly surpassing us. Certainly we've done better than Spain and Ireland and Greece and Portugal, okay? But we have done much worse than many other countries in the world. There's countries like Germany, Korea, Austria, where they can claim to have truly repaired the damage from the recession. So this claim that we're the best in the world is absolutely unfounded. The official unemployment itself doesn't tell the whole story because of that problem that we discussed of people leaving the labor force. If we take the official unemployment, which is around 1.4 million, we add in people who've given up looking, we add in involuntary part-time workers who are working part-time even though they want full-time, we add a portion of their time to reflect their underemployment, and other pools of hidden unemployment. True unemployment in Canada is closer to 2.5 million people, or maybe around 12% of the labor force. So this sense of complacency that there's no problem about the number of jobs, it's just a question of matching the right people with the right positions, a matchmaking type of position, a matchmaking type of function is wrong. Now just imagine, for the ideology of austerity and scarcity, what would happen if we put those people back to work, the unemployed and underemployed and hidden unemployed in our system? What if we actually put them back to work? We won't put them all back to work. We'll just put most of them back to work. Okay, we'll put 2 million Canadians back to work. On average, a typical Canadian generates $100,000 of value added per year. Okay, they don't get paid $100,000, that's different, but they on average produce $100,000 worth of goods or services per year. So putting those 2 million people back to work creates $200 billion worth of new GDP. The governments in Canada at all levels automatically take 35 cents on the dollar just with the existing tax structure that we have. We don't have to increase taxes at all. And lo and behold, we've taken $70 billion in new government revenue across the country at all levels. The total combined deficits of the federal government and all the provinces, including Nova Scotia, last year was $25 billion. So you pay off those deficits entirely, and you got $45 billion in additional incremental resources just from putting Canadians back to work. So what happened to the ideology of scarcity and austerity? We can have schools with swimming pools in them. We can have universities with actual professors in them, as opposed to sessional instructors. We can have the schools and hospitals and everything else that we need, and then some. We can have green energy. We can have public transit. We can have pharmacare. We can have early childhood education out of that $70 billion in new revenue. We can have all those things as long as Canadians have the chance to work for them. Employers, of course, are always complaining about the shortage of workers. For them, the normal situation is you put an ad on the internet, and the next day you get 100 applicants from people willing to work for less, right? That's the situation that they've come to be used to. In fact, the fact that they're able to recruit people in this chronically underutilized labor market reinforces their determination to use precarious work as their business model. Okay, normally in a labor market that was really working, if an employer said, come and work for me, I'll give you 5 hours this week, I might give you 10 next week, I'm not so sure about the next week because it's kind of slow, but we'll see, okay? In a normal labor market, somebody who needed full-time work, and most of us, or at least steady work, even steady part-time work, would say, go jump off that cliff. I'm not taking a job like that. There's better ways to use my time and energy. But in this labor market, employers have gotten used to that offer actually being accepted by people because they're so desperate. And that reinforces their determination to use precarious work management strategies. And in fact, you get whole cottage industries springing up. You get software, for example, precisely aimed at allowing something like a restaurant to manage hours scheduling among way too many workers, okay, and then divvy them up amongst the workers in an automated fashion so that each worker gets enough to stay there, but you still get maximum flexibility for the employer. Or employment agencies, the ubiquitous employment agency, and so on. So that's the normal situation. They complain about skills shortage anytime they actually have to go and look for people, or train people on the job, or God forbid, give somebody a raise because they actually have a skill that's in strong demand. In reality, there's no evidence of a labor shortage in Canada at all. And most of this nonsense from Mr. Kenney and others about the skills shortage is all about blaming the victim. Objectively, Canadian workers actually have more training than any other workforce in the world. That's an astounding statement. That's even better than the men's hockey team winning the gold medal at the Olympics. Canadian workers have more post-secondary training than any other workforce in the world, over 50% of Canadian workers. Millions of Canadians have skills that they don't remotely use. Statistics Canada actually does a survey of vacancies. So this idea that there are vacant jobs going unfilled because employers can't find the right workers. They actually do a survey of businesses. They estimate there's about 200,000 vacancies at any given point in time. It's barely 1% of the labor force. And in any labor market, you're going to have some vacancies, right? When somebody retires or quits, the vacancy is created. The employer has to advertise the position, take the resumes, do the interviews, make an offer, and then wait for the job to start. That's going to take a certain period of time, and in even the most full employment situation. So most of those 200,000 are what you'd normally expect. There might be 50, 60, 70,000 jobs in fields like computer programming or specialized engineers where they truly have a hard time finding someone. I doubt it's that many myself. In reality, Think back to that 2.35 million unemployed people, compare it to 50 or 60 or 70,000 true vacancies, and that's why I say Mr. Kenney should spend 95% of his time creating jobs, maybe 5% of his time helping to fill those jobs that are truly unfilled. The bigger agenda, of course, is to blame the victims of unemployment for their plight and use the rhetoric of scarcity, skills shortage, and mismatch to bring in some of these other changes that they would like to see anyway, like the temporary foreign worker program, the changes in EI to compel people to accept lower wages and to travel up to an hour each way for new jobs and so on. Their goal is to claw down the state of the labor market, reduce the expectations of workers, create a more disciplined, compliant workforce, and therefore a less costly workforce. Politically, it serves a useful function, as we saw from Mr. Kenney's quote, to shift attention for unemployment away from the government and away from businesses and onto the shoulders of individual workers who are supposedly ill-suited for the jobs that are out there. The reality is there are almost no jobs out there. Of course, part of this is also a whole anti-union agenda as well, and we've seen that in spades from the federal government. Of course, we've also seen it in spades already from your new government here in Nova Scotia. It's amazing, in the matter of a few months of being in office, there's any number of anti-labor measures coming from this government, again, all justified with that same rhetoric of austerity, scarcity, belt tightening. There is no choice. The idea that we just can't afford to pay people decently and give them collective representation anymore because of what? Because of a shortage, because of problems, because we can't do things like that anymore. It's very vague, the connections, but if they say that theme of scarcity and austerity over and over again enough, they hope that people will believe it. Of course, from a public policy point of view, there's nothing that's more useful in enhancing the austerity narrative, if you like, than this whole fear-mongering about debts and deficits. And of course, deficits can arise for all kinds of reasons. You could have a genuine structural deficit where you're actually not collecting enough in taxes to pay for the regular normal cost of the services that you provide. Those are very rare, certainly rare in the Canadian situation. More common is what's called a cyclical deficit, where the government gets a deficit as an automatic side effect of a downturn in employment and value added and the overall state of the economy. If fewer people are working, that means they're paying less income taxes. That means they're buying less stuff and paying less sales taxes. And in the unlikely event they can actually qualify, they might be collecting employment insurance. So your revenues go down, and to some extent your expenses go up. That creates a cyclical deficit as an automatic result of a downturn in the economy. And the solution to that problem is obvious. The debt is obviously the sum total of deficits that you run in a series of years. And debt, even though it is a four-letter word, it isn't something to panic about, contrary to the narrative. There's all kinds of reasons why debt is not a problem and in fact can actually be a good thing. If it's incurred to pay for public investment, that is, you're going into debt to pay for something that's long-lived and productive and useful, that's absolutely rational. In fact, you're stupid not to do it if the investment that you're making with debt is more productive than the cost of the debt that you're undertaking. You do want to make sure that debt is stable as a share of your GDP, or at least not growing forever, and you do want to make sure that interest rates are not too high. So if those conditions are met, if debt is used for useful investments, it's manageable as a share of GDP, and the interest burden is not too high, then debt isn't a problem at all, and in fact debt can be a good thing, not a bad thing. I'll talk about this because this is the reason why I went to university and got a PhD in economics, because I learned there, doing my PhD, that a fraction has a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is the thing on top, the denominator is the thing on the bottom. The true way to measure a debt burden is not in dollars, or even millions of dollars, or even billions of dollars. if you read Laurel Broughton's report, she's so patronizing in this thing. I'm so glad we sent her to you from Ontario, because she's nauseating. She says the debt is measured in billions of dollars, but you pathetic little Nova Scotians can't understand numbers that big. So let me break it down for you to $15,000 per person. Oh, okay, well now I understand, because I couldn't have figured that out myself until you came from Ontario to tell me about it. I'm sorry, by the way. I'm sorry that you got her. So you have a numerator and a denominator, so you can reduce the debt burden by either reducing the numerator, trying to reduce your debt, or by growing the denominator. That is, increasing your income as a society, your capacity to service debt. And rather than looking at the debt in dollars, this is the appropriate way to do it. Now, in terms of the denominator, Nova Scotia's performance right now isn't half bad, actually. Nova Scotia this year, they, according to the bank forecast, this is the Royal Banks, will have the third fastest rate of GDP growth of any province in Canada. And in fact, there's a number of things on the go here, right? There's the gas, the offshore gas, there's the electricity connection, there's the ship building contract that's coming, that's starting to gear up. And lots of other projects that are clearly going to add to the level of income and the generation of goods and services here. So in terms of the denominator, Nova Scotia doesn't look too shabby. And of course, part of our progressive strategy around debts and deficits and public services and resisting austerity has to be putting people back to work. I'm not averse to having a discussion about the economy and creating jobs and generating incomes. We need those things in order to pay for the stuff that we want. In fact, my whole thesis is that's exactly how we pay for the stuff that we want. So on the denominator side, it's not too bad at all. On the numerator side, this is our so-called debt crisis that we're facing in Nova Scotia. If you measure it correctly as a share of GDP, then in fact, Nova Scotia's debt has declined dramatically from the so-called worrisome days of the 1990s, when the debt to GDP ratio was 45%. It has bounced back since the Great Recession, okay, of 2009, and that's because the numerator the numerator grew. Look, I say I got my PhD with numerators and denominators. I can't even keep them straight myself. The numerator grew and the denominator shrank. So for both reasons, the debt ratio grew. But that increase is not dramatic in the historic scheme of things, not nearly as dramatic as the 2008 recession was in its own right. What's more, the current budget targets, okay, even before Ms. Broughton came along, the current budget targets have the debt to GDP ratio starting to fall next year. So the budget wouldn't be balanced, but the debt to GDP ratio would start falling next year, which means you're adding less to the debt than the size of economic growth that's occurring. And that's what you want to watch for. So by that measure, the problem's already solved. In fact, remember the other issue I raised, which is what are you paying for interest? The thing that's different between now and the 1990s is interest rates are about 2% rather than 10%. And it's doubly virtuous, because every time the provincial government pays off, or it doesn't even pay off, just renews a bond, there are bonds that were issued in the 90s at 10% that are coming due that the government can now refinance at 2%. So there's an enormous savings for the government as it rolls over bonds that come due. And for that reason, you can't even see the so-called crisis in terms of the province's debt service charges. So this isn't the debt as a share of GDP anymore. This is the debt service, how much the government has to pay in interest on the debt. And because interest rates have fallen so much and are going to stay low because the global recovery has been so weak, there's no uptick at all in the debt service burden to the province. So what this means is, in fact, the province can handle much more debt than it used to because interest rates are so low. The other piece of it, of course, in Nova Scotia and everywhere else is this so-called animal farm theory of debt. You've all read George Orwell, of course, being here in a university where we study great works of literature, at least when we have tenure-track faculty to teach it. The animal farm theory, of course, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Apply that theory to public finance, and you get the equally nonsensical moniker, private debt good, public debt bad. Okay? This idea that, yes, of course, businesses take on debt all the time, and they should. If business sees an investment opportunity and they need to borrow money to finance it, and the profit they're going to make from that opportunity is higher than the rate of interest that they pay on the debt, it's irrational not to go into debt as a business. And if I was a CEO and I came out and said what some of these finance ministers always say, if I was a CEO of a big corporation and I came out and said, you know, mom and pop sitting at home managing their household budget, they can't spend more than they take in. I'm not going to spend more than we take in either. He would be fired, right? He'd be fired within the week as a superstitious idiot who shouldn't be in charge of any real corporation. Because, of course, business understands perfectly well the principle of leverage, which means you get more bang for the buck in business. In fact, if you're in the financial speculation business, it's try borrowing $50 for every dollar of your own that you've placed on the latest derivative or foreign exchange, right? So no CEO would ever say, I'm going to get rid of debt as my first priority. Same thing with households too, by the way. Mom and pop, it turns out, were spending more than they took in. That's why debt service, that's why the debt burden for households has gone up. And that's why people can buy cars and houses. Okay, because guess what? You can't do that if you have to pay for it out of the money you've saved in your pocket. And it's a good thing they go into debt. Otherwise, we'd all be wearing barrels today. So part of the resistance to austerity and the narrative of austerity has to be, how come businesses and households can borrow, but governments and public agencies aren't supposed to? That doesn't make sense. It's completely arbitrary. Of course, it all trickles down into our fight to preserve programs and services at the grassroots level. All of this fear-mongering about debt is all about trying to get us to accept cutbacks in things that we deserve, including a high-quality secondary education, high-quality post-secondary education, also high-quality early childhood education, a big one we have to fight for. The true constraint on our ability to pay from the government level is that the debt can't grow forever as a share of our GDP, and we see that that's not happening. And the best way to solve that revenue problem is to put people back to work, generating income. We can continue to run moderate deficits. As I mentioned, in Nova Scotia, the debt to GDP ratio is going to start declining, even though the deficit per se will still be there. We can also collect taxes. Now, I don't think that either of these are the ultimate solution. I think the ultimate solution is to put people back to work. Then we could generate the revenue we need without increasing taxes. But until such time as we get there, we can certainly argue for moderate ongoing deficits and, where need be, tap other sources of revenue on the tax side. Here's what's happening on taxes. Of course, the finance minister says we've got a huge deficit, so we have to cut. A very well-informed citizen in the audience, I suspect she's a member of the Dalhousie Faculty Association, actually, from her very informed question, says you created that deficit with your tax cuts. And the finance minister concedes, yes, I'm very clever. And that actually is how it's happened. I just mentioned that at the federal level. The government, this prudent government, has actually pushed the federal government back into deficit by approving this income-splitting tax cut. In Nova Scotia, it's hard to believe that there's some kind of problem in terms of our ability to collect taxes to pay for the services that we need. And again, this is where this sense of doom and gloom that pervades the Broughton report is especially surprising. This shows the two major sources of provincial government revenues, the ones that are collected within Nova Scotia, and then the transfer payments that come from the federal level of government. The own source revenues have trended up very, very modestly by less than a percentage point of GDP over the last quarter century. The federal government transfers have trended down as a share of GDP, and we know, of course, that's going to accelerate with the cuts to the Canada Health transfer that the government's already announced. So on an all-in basis, there's no trend that taxes are high, that taxes are unsustainable, that somehow we cannot continue to collect those taxes and probably more as we go forward. I don't see any makings of a crisis there. And this is where, again, the ideology of austerity is deliberately trying to create a crisis where none exists, or at least create a sense of crisis where none exists. If in fact our deficit is primarily due to the fact that people aren't working when they could be working, as opposed to too much spending or too much taxing. Well, the solution of austerity is rather perverse because they are going to cut program spending, eliminate the incomes and jobs that come from that program spending, and thereby make the underlying problem in the denominator that much worse. In fact, if it's done very badly or in a very extreme way, that can actually tip you back into a recession. Even in a best case scenario, when the government says, I'm going to save $1 billion by cutting program spending, they are going to swim against a very strong macroeconomic tide. Because by cutting $1 billion from program spending, they're cutting at least $1 billion and probably more from the total income that's generated in the economy, probably more than $1 billion because of the multiplier effects of the spending and respending that occur. And therefore, they're going to take a big chunk out of their own tax revenues because of the reduction in incomes and GDP that they themselves have fostered. At worst, they can actually throw the economy back into a recession and make the deficit itself worse. So at best, you're swimming against the tide. At worst, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And this is where the Greek analogy, okay, with my friend Zorba here, comes in. They says we're all going to become Greece if we don't follow the austerity recipe. But in fact, it was the austerity recipe that created this catastrophe that we see in Greece and in some of the other peripheral European countries. The more they cut, under the dictates of the IMF and the European Union and the other unelected bureaucrats, the so-called troika that came to town to oversee this thing, the more GDP shrank and the higher the debt ratio became. The debt ratio in Greece today is higher than it was 5 years ago when the whole austerity thing began, precisely because of the unintended damage, to be generous, the unintended damage that was done to the underlying economy. And it's going to get worse because things are so bad in a place like Greece that anyone who can leave wants to leave. And that obviously shatters the ability of society to rebuild as you go forward. Even the IMF now admits that this advice was wrong, okay? They are not going to pay compensation for it. In fact, they aren't even really letting up on their dictates, but at least they admit that it was wrong. The real lesson of Europe is not do austerity or forever regret it. The real lesson in Europe is don't give up control of your own money. That's what happened to Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Ireland. This is why Japan can have a debt to GDP ratio that's twice as high as Greece's with no problem, because they have their own currency, their own banking system, and they can create money. This is why America has a debt ratio that's approaching Greece's, no problem, because they have their own Federal Reserve that can print money, as they have done by the trillions, to help keep the whole thing going. So the lessons of the Greek experience are being completely manipulated. The last of those myths that I put up right at the beginning, the idea that there is no choice, and that is absolutely wrong as well. Budgets are all about choices. We collectively as human beings produce the goods and services that we need. We generate the incomes, including tax revenues, from the work that we do. We collectively will choose, whether in a democratic way or not, choices will be made about how those resources are used and who is going to benefit from the consumption of those. And that is all about power, okay? It's all about the ability of some groups in society to have their interests looked after and the ability of other groups not to be able to do the same thing. There's nothing preordained about what's happening in our economy or in our public policy choices that we make. So we can see these choices at every level of government. Federally, we are the first G7 economy to balance the federal budget since the Great Recession. Is this an achievement? I'm not sure. We've experienced very stagnant GDP. The federal government itself has eliminated 50,000 jobs. So when you start to wonder how come Canada's labor market has done so badly since 2011 when the government hit the austerity brakes, there's one place to start looking. 50,000 positions lost from the federal public administration and $14 billion a year in program spending cuts as a result of that. So I'm not sure that that's anything to cheer about, frankly. I think we're worse off, not better off. Joe Oliver said we've balanced the budget, therefore we're on the path to prosperity, as if balancing the budget and prosperity were synonyms, okay? Well, the two don't have any necessary connection whatsoever. You could balance the budget by shutting government down altogether, okay? The government in South Sudan's budget is more or less balanced because there basically is no government. Does that mean that they're prosperous? Not exactly. Okay, so the two don't go hand in hand. In fact, I think we're worse off because of what's happened. And now that we got there, now that we reached the Holy Grail, the government revealed that it doesn't really care about balanced budget because they just threw us back into deficit with this tax cut scheme. All of the surpluses in the next 3 years, as I mentioned, are rated from EI. The one that I think is a very telling case of how the ideology of austerity is used to enforce choices on people through fear than anything else was a decision they made in the middle of the crisis to postpone the retirement age according to the OAS GIS system from 65 to 67. Now the technocrats have been demanding this for years, right? For at least 25 years, this idea has been floating around Ottawa from people who say governments, especially through this generally funded pension, the OAS, there's no separate fund like there is for the CPP. The OAS just comes out of the government's general revenues. We don't want that. We want to get rid of that. We want to partially de-index it. Remember when Mulroney tried to partially de-index it? The woman stood up and said, "Goodbye, Charlie Brown." And that was it for that idea. So they've been trying to do this for 25 years. And then along comes a recession, a sense of crisis, an ideology of scarcity, and they got it through. Okay? They've put it off 2 years. So it hasn't saved $1. There hasn't been $1 saved to the federal deficit. So it had nothing to do with the deficit because none of the changes will take effect for another 5 or 6 years still. Okay? The government actually boasts about that. They say, don't worry, this won't take effect for another 6 or 8 years. As if doing a stupid thing in 6 or 8 years from now means it's not so stupid, right? All it means is it takes longer to figure out that it was stupid. This is a classic case of shock doctrine austerity in the making because this is something they clearly wanted for years and this was their chance to get it. Okay? It had nothing to do with the deficit. Provincially, we see these choices all over the place. And as I mentioned, the Broughton report should be a case study. In fact, if any of your members, Katrina, teach a course in the politics of public finance, use the Broughton report as a case study in the class, because you'll never find a better example of the manipulation of the ideology of fear and crisis as you will in this one. Read the report. It's full of doom and gloom. The sky is falling. It's unsustainable. We can't keep doing this anymore. Therefore, we better cut income taxes for everyone who makes over $100,000 a year. I mean, I have never seen such a leap since the gold medal triple jump at the last Olympics. You know, I'm full of sports analogies tonight, folks. A sense of crisis, therefore cut taxes on the rich. Okay, and while we're at it, cut them by 2.5 percentage points for corporations at the same time. So is this something they've wanted to do for ages? Yes. Have business-minded governments in Nova Scotia wanted to keep up with the Joneses down the street? We've cut the taxes to 11.5% in Ontario. It hasn't done us a hoot of good. Okay? Business investment spending is lower, not higher. And the only difference the corporate tax cuts made was that $500 billion of idle cash in corporate coffers is now $600 billion of idle cash in corporate coffers. So there is don't believe it for a minute that this is going to spur all of this great job creation and investment. The proof is very strong on that. But it's something that's nice to have if you're a well-heeled person. So we're going to get this personal income tax cut if she has her way. For those making over 100,000, that should be 100K, not 100L. I don't know what $100 a liter is. Over 100K. And then read her report. This just makes you laugh out loud. Do you know why we should do this? Because it simplifies the tax code. To get rid of the top bracket simplifies the tax code. Because you've really got a feel for those people who make over $100,000. When you fill out your income tax, you know, and there's that little thing there, and you have to figure out which column you belong in, it can get so complicated. When you're a high income earner and you're not in the first column, you're not in the second column, you're not even in the third column, you're in the very last column, and you have to do a little bit of subtraction there to figure out how much you actually owe. It's a terrible burden for these people. So we're going to simplify it. And then the rest of the province would pay for that by paying HST on more products, right? We've heard about the diapers and the home heating and so on. Higher personal income taxes on the what you might call middle class or comfortable middle class range, astounding. And then what she calls flatlining spending, which, duh, we didn't fall off a turnip truck yesterday. In an inflationary world, as Katrina said in her opening remarks, that means real cutbacks. Even at the level of individual institutions, it's about choices, the choices that are made. And this is what our friends in the Faculty Association are grappling with. An era of crisis is being created yet again, okay, and this is par for the course. Anytime you hear crisis, the sky is falling, get ready for the other shoe to drop, which means therefore we must tighten our belts. So we have the sense with this government consultation on post-secondary education, a so-called shortfall in university funding. Therefore, get ready. The way it trickles down to the level of an individual institution is through choices, just like at the other levels of governance. Choices about what to spend money on and what not to spend money on. We aren't going to spend it on professional instructors, on regular academic staff. We'll spend it on other things, including all the construction that Katrina mentioned, or this thing. I love this one. There was this category of bureaucrats called associate and assistant vice presidents. There were 3 of them here in 2005, and there's 16 of them today. 16 associate and assistant vice presidents at Dalhousie. I think they need another one. I think they need a 17th associate and assistant vice president to help keep track of the other 16 associate and assistant vice presidents. And frankly, I was glad to hear that there was at least another growth industry out there. You know, we mentioned the employment agencies. Of course, there was a real boom in another industry, which was the sign painting industry. Remember when the stimulus program was still on and the governments had to get all those signs painted saying this is brought to you courtesy of the federal government. There was a tremendous but short-lived boom in the sign building industry, and of course perhaps a more sustained boom in university associate and assistants vice presidents. So where did we get to in our tour of the myths of austerity? We can't afford those things anymore, and fill in the blank for what those things are. It can be anything. Well, the reality is we can afford those things and more, so long as we, as productive human beings, have a chance to work for them. As long as we have a chance to use our brains and brawn to produce goods and services that are useful, to generate incomes, to pay our taxes, then we can have it and more. Governments must cut or we'll all end up like Greece. Greece ended up like Greece precisely because they followed that advice. Other countries which did not follow that advice are going to survive. Greece may not, because of the mindless austerity and the self-defeating nature of austerity. We can't go down that road. We have no choice. We absolutely do have choice. And what we have to do as the rest of us, the ones who are not getting our taxes cut amidst so-called austerity, what we have to do is come together, understand what's happening, organize ourselves to speak out, and then make sure that our choices get heard in those debates, not just the choices of the rich and the powerful. There's nothing inevitable about austerity. Many other countries in the world have done much better than Canada at producing more jobs, more quantity of jobs, higher quality of jobs, building a more inclusive, successful society. We have incredible resources in Nova Scotia and the rest of Canada to put to the task of producing goods and services and lifting the standards of our society. We have the best educated workers in the world. We have people who want to live here and make a commitment and share in the success of our work. We have ample fiscal capacity of government, let alone the ability to create money out of thin air like private banks do or the U.S. Federal Reserve did. We know that it's our labor and our sacrifice that makes the whole economy work. So give us a chance to work, and we will build the best society in the world. So my checklist, my recipe, if you like, we have to show the self-defeating nature of this false ideology of austerity. We have to be stubborn and just reject the human and social consequences of it. So when they try to take away a service, we have to say that's just not acceptable. We're not going to tolerate that we're taking this service away from students, from young people, from sick people, from old people. We can make them pay politically for the demands that they're putting on us, and I sure hope that this Broughton report becomes politically untouchable I'm astounded, as I said at the beginning, that someone would even have the gall to say that in this time and place, and a government that actually tried to implement a tax cut for the rich while taking away from everyone else, given all of the concern about inequality that's been expressed in Canada, should literally be run out of town. Just don't send them back to Ontario. Okay, that's what I'm asking. Remember, it's our work and our capacity to produce, our brains and brawn, that make the whole thing work at all. So give us a chance to work. Give us a chance to pay our bills and pay our taxes, and we'll have the best society going. It hasn't been all doom and gloom out there in this era of austerity. There's enough examples of places where austerity is being resisted, is being disproven, is being rolled back, where people have come together to put austerity on trial rather than ourselves. And I am confident. It might be the double dose of trade union Prozac I take with my orange juice every morning, but I am confident that good people who care about work, good work, doing their work, generating income and paying their taxes can defeat austerity at the end of the day. And that's why I thank you for what you're doing and coming out on a rainy night to hear all about it. So thank you very much for your attention. So I think, Katrina, we've got a little bit of time for some Q&A, if that's in order. Do folks have questions or comments? And I guess because there's a mic there, you'd prefer people to go to the mic, probably for the videographer's benefit. If anyone has a question, please, let's hear it. Hi.
Hi, thanks very much. That was excellent. I have a couple of questions related to one another. I was quite impressed by your figure of putting 2 million people back to work, creating $70 billion in revenue for the government. So does that mean that you could, the government could hire those 2 million people at $35,000 and get that revenue? And the other part of the question is related. And what about the guaranteed income and its effect on the government, on the economy, and the revenues of the government?
Okay, the first question is, could it become a sort of self-financing thing? Could the government itself hire everyone and then use the taxes generated on the incomes to pay off the cost of hiring them in the first place? Most of the time that doesn't work that easily. Okay, I mentioned that the government takes 35 cents of every dollar. So the new income that's generated, the government's only going to get about 1/3 of it back. Now, 1/3 of it back is important, first of all. So it's good to remember that it's not money down the drain from the government's perspective when you're sponsoring a new service. What happens after that depends a bit on what type of a service it is. I think there are cases where a public service can be quote-unquote self-financing if you get some very strong benefits that kind of trickle down from the public service. And childcare may be one of them. There's some very credible research that's looked at the experience of the accessible childcare in Quebec. And one of the side effects of it has been to stimulate more labor force participation and more employment among women, among working moms. And then the extra bang for the buck that comes from that, they think, probably offsets the full cost of providing the child care service. So in most cases, though, you wouldn't get it all back. You would get some of it back, but then you're going to want to do other stuff. Other than just hiring every unemployed person directly to work for the government, you're going to want to do other stuff that's creating jobs in the private sector or the nonprofit sector in order to reach that total of the 2 million. Guaranteed annual income, I think, is a very important discussion to have. There's lots of angles, lots of issues about that. One of them is, how does a guaranteed annual income interact with the other provisions, the other social security provisions that we have, like employment insurance and pensions and that kind of thing. Certainly the idea that you don't want people to starve when they're out of work, that you want to make it simple and a right of being a member of our society to have at least a minimal level of income. That idea is absolutely valid. Hi.
I completely buy the line that prices are manufactured prices.
Yes.
But in a way, I also think that just because they're manufactured might not mean that it might be real anyway. Because if the people who are manufacturing the crisis, the people who are saying, here's where it stops, are JP Morgan, major sources of credit, investment banks, those guys, it's their job to decide whether there's enough real economy and enough service economy, and they call it. They used to say 25% of GDP was the absolute correct measure for, this is like in the 1940s, absolute correct measure for public spending. Yeah, it's moved, and they realized there's not a fixed level. But what I think we're seeing is a decision on the part of people at that kind of level of surveillance of the financial system to cut back on the public sector. And if that's a decision, are they in position to enforce that decision?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Because of their sort of control over the reins of power, of economic power, if you like, they can certainly make life difficult if we're not ready to resist what they're trying to do. So, even if we prevailed, say, and we elected a government and put in place different policies that were truly alternative to austerity, then we've got to be ready for what they're going to do to push back, and our economy is not a democratic place at all, of course, because of the unelected power of wealth and privilege between elections. And I think this is something that will be confronted. You've seen one silver lining to the terrible experience of austerity in Europe has been the emergence of a new generation of progressive political parties over there, like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain and some of the others. And some of them could actually win elections in the next while. But they're going to have to think about what does that mean in terms of the banking system and the capital flows and so on. So I don't want to underestimate the nature of that challenge, but I think it can be confronted, especially if we've got people educated, organized, and mobilized. That's the old activist motto, to get back to basics and say we produce, we can produce, we want to produce, and that's what generates the income. If you're going to take your euros and go away, we'll find another currency that allows us to work, produce, and pay our taxes. If you're going to take your business and go somewhere else, well, we'll find another corporate form that can hire people and put them to work, whether it's a cooperative or a crown corporation or whatever. And some of those ideas will have to be thrown out there eventually. But I think we're a long way from being in a position to pose that kind of a threat to them yet. First, we've got to understand that they're trying to trick us.
So I just wanted to add first a comment from the Broad report. Apparently we need to offer tax cuts for the wealthy because the current highest rate makes Nova Scotia less attractive for corporate executives considering moving here. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I know a few corporate executives in Toronto, and I can't tell you how lovely life is in Toronto. While you're sitting there on the freeway for 2 hours, wasting your life a day and looking at these ugly, ostentatious, overpriced, empty condos all around you, and you've got a hockey team that just loses bitterly year after year. I can't imagine why anyone would ever want to leave that.
Right. So just a slightly more serious observation. We're in a province where we just got this $26 billion shipbuilding contract. The NDP provincial government that negotiated this provided the company that will build the ships, the Irving Shipbuilding Company, something like $250 million in forgivable loans, and yet we're told that there's no money for higher education and cut. So I'm inclined to agree with some of the conclusions that you mentioned. What would you say is the most effective way to communicate this to the provincial public and to try and exert change in a political way? Is it writing handwritten letters to our MPPs? I'm open to suggestions.
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be Prime Minister of Canada. How to change it? How to change? I think, well, I know it sounds hokey, but educate, organize, mobilize sums it up in my view. So the first part of it is educate. So as an economist, with the members of my union and the members of the community and members of the public, I'm trying to help educate us collectively and learn from others in the course of it that austerity is a myth, or at least the economic foundation of austerity is a myth. Austerity is real, unfortunately, the ideology of it, but and show people that it's a myth, and hopefully open people's eyes that there's no reason for us to be tightening our belts. In fact, we should be doing the opposite. Because we can produce more than ever, we should be expansive and optimistic about what we can expect out of life, as opposed to saying that we have to tighten our belts. Then organizing, and organizing I mean in the partly in the electoral system, of course. It's always complicated when you get into elections and parties and all that kind of stuff, but we have to be there. And more importantly, in our communities, you know, day after day, to be fighting around specific issues. And that's exactly what the organizers of tonight are doing. They're in, you know, constant tussles with the university over this exact question. And so part of this is educating and coming up with an alternative narrative to empower people to resist that. So I don't have a recipe book for political action. I think there's incredible diversity and creativity in political action. Just look at the Occupy movement and some of these other things that who would have thought they would have ever come about, but they did. And I do believe optimistically, and this isn't just my Prozac, I do believe optimistically that as long as people are exploited and mistreated, they're going to find ways to fight back. And in that regard, I am eternally optimistic. That wasn't a very good answer. I'm a better economist than I am a politician. Please.
Hi, Jim. Since we're in an academic context here, I wondered if you could expand on or speak to the issue of the impacts of funding for education, in particular post-secondary education. I was interested to see that this fall, I believe it was Bavaria or one of the states in Germany became the last state in Germany to charge tuition at the post-secondary level. So now all post-secondary education in Germany is free, as it is in a number of states in Scandinavia and Sweden, as I understand it. They even pay for the tuition of foreign students who are there. So, as I understand it, one of the important determinants of people's economic contribution to society is the level of education, let alone to their personal well-being, and particularly having students who don't enter into life with gigantic student loans as a albatross around the neck before going into society. So I wonder if that's something that you've looked at the economic impact of devoting resources to have a well-educated populace.
Mm-hmm. It is not something that I personally have looked at. I like the logic that you're following, and I think in a way it's similar to the case we just talked about with the early childhood education, you know, where you think about, okay, you're going to spend money as government, you're going to hire people to do something that's useful. Is it useful and important enough that there'll be other spillover effects from that? In the child care case, it was women's labor force participation. In the case of higher education that you mentioned, it would be greater productivity, lifetime earnings potential, and employability of the people who graduate. So, you know, I would think you could assemble an economic model pretty quickly that showed the increased lifetime earnings potential of graduates would generate incremental tax revenues far in excess of whatever the 4 years of tuition or whatever that were waived would be. Now, it still requires them to be employed after, generating income and paying taxes after. So it's not a free lunch in that regard. But particularly when so many people are idle and unemployed, having the government that can borrow money at 2%, invest in things that have broader, lasting social and economic value is a no-brainer. It's absolutely a no-brainer. If the government can borrow at 2%, which is almost zero in real terms, the government can borrow for 50 years. They're issuing these 50-year bonds at 2%. So that's unbelievable. That's almost free money for 50 years. The only thing stopping us from using that money to build useful things and provide useful services is this ideological phobia about debt. And without that, we would be doing it. And we should be doing it for precisely the types of reasons that you described. Let's put our heads together. On the back of a napkin, I bet we could come up with an input-output model at the bar across the street that proves the point.
I had two questions. The first one is more ideas about how you actually create full employment, especially in a smaller province like Nova Scotia, which is not a center of activity in Ontario or now out west. And you've talked, obviously not going to austerity is one way to prevent the slide being worse. And you've talked about what you were just talking about, which is using 2% money to invest in long-term assets, which makes a lot of sense. And childcare makes a lot of sense. So if you could elaborate on some other ideas that would help us move towards the full employment that would create the public financing you're talking about. And the second thing is that the one thing, I agree with everything you said about the Broden report. The one thing that I did think that was a good idea was the carbon tax. And there's ways in which it should be better than what she's proposed, but I wonder what your thoughts are about carbon tax.
Okay, well the second question is easier than the first, so I'll start there. I mean, the general concept of a carbon tax has potential. Absolutely, it has potential. Now, I'm always cautious of the limits of market mechanisms for solving our environmental problems. I think the argument that all we have to do is price carbon and force companies to internalize these decisions, that will solve the problem, I don't think is enough. But I do think that those can play a role. And what's more, they can generate money that's needed for important investments, including investments in green energy and public transit and cleaning up pollution. So I think the idea has merit, and I'm very encouraged by some work in Canada recently to try and reject the demonization of carbon taxes and cap and trade and all that Harper's been so successful with. You've even got very conservative economists now standing up, even Preston Manning standing up and saying this is nonsense. So if that undermines Harper's ability to use that as a wedge and get reelected, then I'm all for it. In the context of the Broughton report, this is hard to do though, because she's saying, I'm going to collect a carbon tax here, but I'm going to cut income taxes for people over $100,000. Well, shit. I'm paying a carbon tax so they can get a tax cut. Or I'm straight lining spending. I don't want to have a carbon tax and then straight line spending. I want a carbon tax and then invest it in things that are useful. So we'll have to be careful in the context of the Broughton report to not give her any credit for that. The idea itself in a more sensible context certainly has potential. Now the job creation thing, this is tremendously important because there's the nub of the question, and it is much harder to do at a subnational level within a province. I have a list of 5, and I hope I can remember them all in my head, 5 themes for creating jobs. And you listed the first 2. One is to stop shooting ourselves in the foot with austerity. That has clearly hurt. The other is to actually go the other direction and use public investment, including in infrastructure and so on, to create lots of new work. As I mentioned, if you can borrow money at 2%, you should be building everything you can imagine to build, including green energy and public transit and so on, and you'll get tons of jobs coming from that. I think we need active industrial strategies. Or what used to be called industrial strategies. You might more broadly call it sector development strategies now, to look at sectors of the economy, even in the private sector, that have unique, high-value, export-oriented goods and services. So that would include everything from shipbuilding here to some of the energy developments, if they're done right, to even things like film. I know film and digital media and so on is an important industry here. We need a lot more of that. Korea and Germany were 2 of the countries that on my table have in fact fully recovered their labor markets from the recession. And that strategy in both cases of using active government measures to promote export-oriented industries has been very important there. We could do more, I think, in the you know, what's sometimes called the third sector, co-ops, community development, nonprofit agencies, credit unions, as a way of mobilizing money and putting it into motion. Part of the problem we have in Canada is there's so much revenue going to companies. The profit share of GDP is near record levels, but they're sitting on it. They're not putting it back into the economy, and that's a constant drag on the economy. So finding other institutional forms, if you like, other than the private business to put money into motion, stimulate innovation, create new jobs, can be part of it as well. The federal level, of course, has got more leeway. They've got an exchange rate. They've got a central bank. They've got foreign trade policy. At a provincial level, it's trickier, but it's possible. You know, you look at say a place like, even though Italy has been very hard hit by the recession, there's that whole area, Emilia-Romagna, that has all the co-ops that have hardly been touched by the recession, where the unemployment rate's still very low. They use a model based on credit unions to fund small cooperative enterprises, including manufacturing, and they've managed to stay relatively prosperous amidst the overall meltdown. So it is possible to think big, even at a sub-national level, but you have a lot more tools at the national level. That being said, we need a lot more work to flesh out that full employment alternative, and I think that should be one of the priorities. I know Christine's here from the CCPA. That's one of the priorities for our work nationally, I think, and in the regional offices, is to flesh out that idea, or those ideas, I should say. Maureen, hello.
As one of the people who sat at the cabin table when the NDP invested in the Halifax shipyards, where lots of uniform members, by the way, will end up having good jobs. I felt a little defensive at a previous question, and my question, in fact, was more or less Brian's, but about how we create full employment. It was certainly what our government was attempting to do, not necessarily full employment, but our preoccupation was the lack of employment in the province, and not just employment, but good jobs, and good paying jobs, and sector development, and the importance of identifying those places where it would be probably supportable to invest public money and have public support for it. Yet we found out that that, in fact, was not the case, right? So my question is about the relationship of public money and government investment with corporations and big, rich people like the Irvings, and the dilemma for an agenda that you describe around investment, public investment in employment and opportunities for employment without being able to engage, and I know you haven't said this, but without being engaged with the corporate sector. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, in a way, we're digging deeper on one of the ideas that I just mentioned, which is this idea of sector development strategies or industrial strategies involving players in the private sector. And I think that is essential. You know, until such time as we have managed to replace private investment with co-ops and social investment and crown corporations, you know, we need to work with the private sector, and we need to demand and elicit more from the private sector. We have to lift the game of the private sector, and that means, in my books, using, you know, a combination of carrots and sticks, doing a lot less of across-the-board corporate tax cuts that have no conditionality whatsoever. They reward the companies that are socking money away, and use, you know, fiscal tools and trade policy and direct capital investment as ways to leverage more activity. So the principle of working with private companies, including investing public money in private companies, I'm very much in favor of. And we've seen this in all kinds of industrial examples in Canada, whether it's auto or aerospace or shipbuilding or telecommunications. And I think there's lots of new areas where it could be. Last week I was at an event organized by the BC CCPA. They had a one-day Good Job Summit in Vancouver, and they brought in a bunch of people to talk about different job creation strategies. And a very interesting idea in this realm came from Finland, where they have a very active strategy around digital media production, including video games and different computer programs and stuff like that. And instead of just handing out tax subsidies, which we've done a lot of in Canada, you know, sometimes with decent results, sometimes not, they have a holding company, a publicly owned holding company that makes strategic equity placements, almost like a kind of angel investor, but in the name of the taxpayer, in some of the companies that are seen to have more potential. And that's found to be more effective to actually get them to do stuff in Finland than a tax rebate. It's a form of public ownership, but it's a way of tailoring private sector activity in a way that's valuable. Another example of this that I've been studying, actually, for the second edition of my book, I mention it, is in Singapore. Singapore is not really, you know, a hotbed of socialism, but they have some interesting forms of social ownership, of public ownership in Singapore, including a state investment holding company called Temasek that has equity stakes in about 50 different industrial companies in Singapore, where they've been trying to diversify Singapore's economy. And once again, a very, I think, creative and modern application of public ownership as a tool for industrial development. And some of those ideas might have more potential than just big subsidies. I still think subsidies probably are important, and the fact that Irving is rich is not the relevant dimension. We're not giving it to Irving because he needs money. We're giving it to Irving or someone else to try and get him to do something that we need here. And if it's done well, will generate more money back for the government than they spent. That's harder and harder to do the more freedom we give companies to do anything they want. We've discovered this in the auto industry. You know, we used to have rules that required auto companies to produce in Canada as well as sell here. Once we signed NAFTA, and now we're signing free trade with Europe and Korea, there's no compulsion on them to produce anything here anymore. So then you're really going against the tide to try and get a company to invest here instead of Mexico. And in fact, we had this experience with Ford just recently, trying to get them to invest in a high-tech energy conserving engine and build it here. And they said, okay, we'll build it here if the government makes up the full cost difference between producing it here and producing it in Mexico. Well, that's a non-starter, isn't it? You know, and the government said, no way. So it's going to be built in Mexico. As long as we give the companies so much freedom in everything, it's going to be harder and harder for us to inspire them, incite them, constrain them, whip them into doing that kind of work that we need here. But I think we can be creative about finding ways to do it. Maybe one more, Katrina, then we'll let us go and have a beer and work on our input-output model, which I've already got some of the parameters for it.
Hi, this is another follow-up to the earlier question.
Okay, follow-up to the follow-up.
That Maureen referred to. I'd just like to issue a caution. I think it's part of the politics of austerity and scarcity and the shock doctrine to attempt to turn groups of workers against each other under perhaps the mistaken assumption that economics is a zero-sum game here.
Yes.
If somebody else loses, my group loses. And I think when the government attempted, and well, it'll be years yet before we see how well it works out, to invest in a large number of ongoing, well-paid, unionized, skilled jobs in one part of Halifax, I don't think that should be seen as a choice not to invest in universities, or at least a necessary choice. There's no reason why we can't have both an investment that helps to secure that large number of skilled industrial jobs and an investment in university that will put it back on a better track. And I think we just need to be careful about thinking we're forced into those kinds of unpalatable choices.
Yes, no, I think that point's very well taken, especially if we've got a successful base of well-paying industrial jobs, then we're going to be generating tons of tax revenue to pay for universities with. And that's exactly how Germany managed to eliminate tuition fees. The fact that they own 20% of Volkswagen, okay, and that Volkswagen hasn't closed a factory in Germany since the end of World War II, and they've got all kinds of other effective industrial strategies, has helped them build that base for a good social system. And your point about not turning worker against worker is so important. And this is their whole divide and conquer strategy. I'm still agog at the attack on public sector workers, including professors, on the pension front, you know. And they stand up and say, well, nobody in the private sector has a defined benefit pension anymore. Why should you have one? You know, and that's like saying, you know, two guys walking down you know, a dark street in Halifax late Tuesday night, and somebody comes and mugs one of them, steals his wallet. They call the police officer comes and says to the other person, you've still got your wallet. That's not fair. Give me your wallet. Okay? That's what they want to do. They want to steal it from everyone because they've stolen it from some of us. And we should be saying, no, give it back to all of us as the end. So, well, thank you very much. Those were great questions, a great audience. Thank you for what you're doing.